Hi, everyone. Let's take some time to talk about the heart. We're all more or less familiar with the heart, right? It's in our chest, just a little bit left of center here. It has a base and an apex, and oddly enough, the base is on top. It's the wider part of the heart. The apex is on the inferior part there. It's the point. And here you can see that at the base on top is where the great vessels either enter or exit the heart. So you might say that it's all about the base, no apex. The heart has four main chambers. The right atrium, which receives deoxygenated blood from the body, and then moves to the right ventricle, which pumps blood out through the pulmonary circuit. There are actually two circuits of blood in your body. Pulmonary circuit goes to the lungs, drops off CO2, picks up oxygen, and that oxygenated blood then goes back to the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, which pumps it out to the rest of the body to bring oxygen to your tissues. So you always enter the heart via an atrium, right? You always leave the heart by a ventricle pumping, right? And the right side of the heart has deoxygenated blood coming back from the body, and the left side of the heart has oxygenated blood getting ready to leave to go out to the body. The heart is in an area called the mediastinum. Sounds like gloriostinum, which is this area in your thorax between your lungs, or between the two pleural cavities, essentially. The heart is surrounded by something called the pericardium, which is it's a cavity. It's a sac-like structure that is a cavity that surrounds the heart. On the very outside of it is the fibrous pericardium, which is a connective tissue layer, but it's protective. It's a lot of collagen. And then you have serous pericardium, not as in the opposite of ridiculous, but as in the type of membrane you produce serous fluid. And that is right on the heart. And then in between the two serous layers, you have the pericardial cavity, which is full of fluid. And that fluid is important because your heart is, constantly beating, right? Which means motion. And, if your heel, rubs up against your shoe because you got a hole in your sock or something, you might get a blister. And you might rest your foot for a while and the blister goes away. But your heart, if it rubs up against the stuff around it, it can't rest, right? Your heart is going to be going for the rest of your life. So you have to have a nice lubricating sac around it full of this fluid. Now you may remember this image from last semester. In Bio 151, you talked about some of these serous membranes briefly. But the pericardial cavity is around the heart. The heart is not inside the cavity. So it's as if you put your fist in a balloon. And if this is a water balloon, right, and you push your fist in it, your fist isn't wet from the water in the balloon. So you're not inside the balloon, right? And then it leads to two layers of rubber or tissue in the case of the pericardium. The layer that's right around your fist or your heart here is called the visceral layer or the visceral pericardium. The layer on the outside is called the parietal pericardium. The space in between is that pericardial cavity. You can see this pretty effectively here, right? This can become inflamed. That's called pericarditis. You can get excess fluid around it. All of those things are bad and can harm your heart. Here's a superior view. So looking up from kind of where the head would be down, you can see this pericardial cavity around the heart here. This would be the visceral pericardium. This would be the parietal pericardium. And you can see there's also a similar cavity around the lungs, which is called the pleural cavity. And we'll talk about that when we get to the respiratory system. Your heart has three layers of tissue. You'll find this with a lot of hollow tubes and organs in your body. 3 layers of tissue, more or less. The innermost layer is usually made of epithelium or endothelium in this case. This is called the endocardium, made of endothelium. The middle layer is often made of muscle. In this case, that's the myocardium. Makes sense. Myo means muscle, cardium means heart. And then the outer layer is called the epicardium. Now, in this case, the epicardium, which is the outer layer of the heart, is also the visceral pericardium, meaning the inner part of that pericardial sac there. It's the same layer. It's just the epicardium as it relates to the tissue layers of the heart. It's the visceral pericardium as it relates to the pericardial sac. You can also see then the pericardial cavity full of serous fluid, the parietal pericardium out here, and then you also have your fibrous layer on the outside that's protective. If you look at just the pericardium, you can see it looks like it sort of squeezes, like, you know, when you're wringing something out, like to get all of the fluid out of there, right? That's what the pericardium looks like, and it's kind of what it is, right? You're twisting this muscle to push all of that fluid out the aorta or the pulmonary trunk, depending on whether you're going through the systemic circuit or the pulmonary circuit. Cardiac muscle is made of myocardiocytes, or cardiac muscle cells. And they're similar to skeletal muscle in that they contract, they have, you know, a thick and thin filaments, they have striations, but they're smaller, right? Skeletal muscle cells are super long. Cardiac muscle cells connect together, which is why you have these intercalated discs. You probably recognize those from your tissue chapter last semester. Those are there because there are lots of proteins there that make up gap junctions. And gap junctions are like tubes that allow ions to flow from one myocardiocyte to the next. That allows them to coordinate their contraction, so they can contract together at the same time. And having a coordinated contraction amongst your cardiac muscle cells is very, very important for the function of the heart. If you remember from 151, fast twitch and slow twitch skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle is a lot more like slow twitch in that it is not a speed muscle, it's an endurance muscle, right? And because of that, it has to be aerobic in terms of how you make ATP. And that means that it stores a lot of O2. You've got a molecule called myoglobin there. It's a lot like hemoglobin. It stores oxygen in the heart muscle. And you have lots and lots of mitochondria for the production of ATP. Now let's look at some heart anatomy. So the external anatomy, if you look here in the front, the anterior aspect, you can see this right atrium and the left atrium. But notice that what you're seeing is really the auricle of the atrium, which is this extra flap of tissue on the outside, kind of like the auricle of your ear, right? But it's really a fillable, expandable pouch within the atrium. You also have two grooves. Remember, a sulcus is our term for a groove. So you have the coronary sulcus, which is kind of between the atrium and the ventricles, right here. It's filled with fat that's cushioning blood vessels. And you have an anterior interventricular sulcus, which is anterior, right? And it's between the two ventricles, the left and the right. So it's interventricular, between the ventricles. You can also see this little tiny ligament that holds the pulmonary trunk and the aorta together. It's called your ligamentum arteriosum. Very Harry Potter, I know. If you look at the back of the heart, you can also see a bunch of vessels and all four chambers, right? Left and right atria, left and right ventricles. You can see the superior and inferior vena cava. Both of these bring deoxygenated blood back to the right atrium of the heart. Superior vena cava from your head and your arms. Inferior vena cava from everything else. You have all four of your pulmonary veins. You have two left pulmonary veins, two right pulmonary veins. These bring oxygenated blood back from your lungs to your heart. Now, you tend to think of veins as being deoxygenated, but in this case, they're oxygenated because they're coming back from the lungs, right? All it means to be a vein is that you're returning to the heart. And while your systemic veins are returning without oxygen to the heart, in your pulmonary circuit, it's reversed. Your pulmonary arteries are deoxygenated, leaving to go pick up oxygen at the lungs. Once they've got oxygen, they come back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. You also have another interventricular sulcus back here, filled with fat and blood vessels. Again, between the left and right ventricle, interventricular, but this one is the posterior interventricular sulcus. Your heart is made of living tissue, just like the rest of your body. And so it, like the rest of your body, requires oxygen and glucose to make ATP and continue functioning. And so you have to deliver blood to your heart. So you have special vessels that really are the first to leave your aorta. So as they leave the heart into the aorta, they send some blood right back to the heart. And these are called your coronary arteries. or your coronary circulation. If you've ever had someone say like, oh, I had a coronary, that means generally you had a blockage in one of these little coronary arteries feeding your myocardial tissue of your heart, and they may have had a myocardial infarction or heart attack because that tissue can die if you block your coronary artery leading to it. Now you have two main coronary arteries, a left and a right coronary artery. Again, this is from the perspective of the patient. It's their left and their right. Your right coronary artery comes around the back, and we'll look at what it does in the back in a moment. It will end up forming your posterior interventricular artery. Your left coronary artery branches pretty quickly. The front branch, this right here, goes down the interventricular sulcus and becomes your anterior interventricular artery. The other half does a little circle back here to the back, and it's called the circumflex artery. I had a student in this class mention that they think the left ventricle looks more like a circle because it has so much muscle, and so the circumflex is on the left side. That's how they remember it. Also, because the left ventricle is so much larger than the right, because it has to push blood through your entire systemic circuit and back, it's very, very muscular. And so the circumflex artery, right, is on the left side. Here's another labeled view of the circumflex artery and anterior interventricular artery. Notice that you also, eventually, all these arteries will branch into what are called marginal arteries. This just means that they're smaller and smaller and smaller, and we are not going to learn their names in this class. Now, this is from the posterior angle. As promised, the right coronary artery comes around and branches down here and becomes the posterior interventricular artery, whereas on the left side, the circumflex artery comes down and then branches into more marginal arteries. Now, wherever you have arteries that are bringing blood to tissue, you have to have veins that are drawing that blood away after it's visited the tissues. Instead of calling these coronary veins, we generally call them cardiac veins. So instead of the anterior interventricular artery here, you have what's called the great cardiac vein that comes back up and then around the back past the circumflex artery. And all of these over here are anterior cardiac veins. If you swing around to the posterior side, that great cardiac vein that came up the anterior interventricular sulcus and swings around the back dumps into what's called the coronary sinus. Now you also have a middle cardiac vein back here in the posterior interventricular sulcus that also dumps into the coronary sinus. Ultimately, all of this stuff dumps into the coronary sinus. It's where all of the blood from the coronary system dumps. So I definitely want you to remember that coronary sinus. And it ultimately dumps its blood back into the right atrium. So the right atrium gets deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, from the arms and head, the inferior vena cava from the chest and abdomen and legs, and the coronary sinus from the heart itself. Now, how does the blood have pressure to move through the coronary circuit? Well, first of all, there's a lot of blood pressure right there in the aorta. But most of what pushes it back down the aorta through that right and left coronary artery is elastic rebound. So the aorta is a giant artery that takes wild swings in pressure. So every time there's a contraction or systole of the ventricles, right, that increase in pressure pushes it out, right? So it has to be a little stretchy. And then as soon as that pressure drops during relaxation of the ventricles or diastole, it snaps back. It has lots of elastic tissue in there. And that snapback actually creates a spike in pressure and pushes blood through those coronary arteries and to the tissue of your heart. Okay, now that we've explored external heart anatomy as well as the coronary circulation, next video we're going to take a look at internal heart anatomy.